Welcome to all of you here in Africa and around the world. This is Let's Talk About Health in Africa on Utano Podcast. I am Lenias Hwenda, and my guest today is Craig Lipset, the co-chair of Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance. Today on Utano Podcast, we are discussing decentralized clinical trials. What are they? Can they solve some of the challenges that are often encountered when doing clinical trials to test whether medical interventions work as well as they should? We'll be asking Craig, can decentralized clinical trials work in the African context? Craig, it's a pleasure to have you on Utano Podcast. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to get to connect and share with your audience today.
Excellent. So, Craig, the idea of decentralized clinical trials may not be immediately clear to a lot of people. So let's start by exploring what decentralized clinical trials are.
It's a great question and a great place to start the conversation. Decentralized clinical trials simply means we're leveraging tools, technology, and processes that can help make research more accessible for more people. It means that we're using these tools in ways that let patients and participants have more choice and flexibility in how and where they participate. These are studies that are leveraging different decentralized research methods, many of which have been available for us for years, some of which simply saw more adoption during the global pandemic. These are tools like using video for remote visits, using home health and visiting nurses, using different electronic strategies for collecting from informed consent to different types of digital measurements. These are approaches like letting patients use local imaging and local lab facilities for specimen collection, and strategies like extending our supply chain so that people can access their investigational medicines from home or from other locations more convenient to them. Study researchers are using these approaches to help improve patient factors like experience, access, equity, representation. They're also using them for factors like improving resilience and continuity for research in the event of unpredictable events that increasingly feel like we should be able to anticipate, whether it's another pandemic or war or other factors that may stand in the way of a patient reaching a research site.
In essence, really expanding the scope of what clinical investigators are able to do, putting more tools in their hands, more inclusion, the ability to continue even under conditions that are not optimal, like during health emergencies. So let's talk about the advantages of using the decentralized approach to doing clinical trials compared to the traditional approach.
Fair question. A traditional research study typically means that we have research sites and investigators at those sites who are really only able to either enroll patients into studies that are in close geographic proximity, that they can travel in and out of those sites for different visits, or they place significant burden on those patients, their families, their caregivers to travel a great distance in order to reach that site. In many cases, in interventional clinical trials, patients accept that burden despite the economic, the personal, the family burden that might create in order to access an investigational new medicine, in order to access hope for a new treatment for themselves or for others like them. Decentralizing research simply means we can expand that radius. It gives us a way that no longer must a person be geographically linked to the research site, but that now those individuals can participate despite distance, improving both convenience and access, but hopefully improving equity as well, so that participation isn't just for the privileged who have the means and the time and capacity to be able to travel in order to participate.
So in essence, they save time and money and increase equity and a whole lot of other advantages?
Well, it's a lot certainly about patient factors, recruitment, retention, representation. I think the economics around decentralized are still out to be seen. Including a lot of these new approaches has a cost to them as well. Hopefully, it helps to reduce or replace other costs in the study, such as those associated with patient factors that make it difficult for them to participate. But I think for study teams today, there is likely not to be a realistic near-term cost savings. Most of the studies that we've seen so far have pointed to opportunities to reduce time to market for a new medicine, and so hopefully recover those costs through speed. Now, for those few studies that can be fully decentralized, there probably is a near-term direct economic impact and savings, but most trials that we're seeing today are more of a hybrid approach. We still have research sites. We're just using these types of tools and methods to help improve access to those sites. And in those hybrid models, the economics tend to come out closer to neutral.
So are there some medical conditions, Craig, that are better suited to the decentralized approach than others? Because you talk about using the decentralized approach as an additional tool, and that people are still using them both side by side with the traditional approach.
It's a great question. I think when we first started doing work in this field, 17, 18 years ago, there were many that thought that this would be an approach limited to dermatology, limited to certain primary care indications, maybe vaccine research. And yet today, we're seeing these approaches penetrating into oncology trials, really into rare disease, into the full spectrum of clinical trial molecules and trials across the portfolio. And we're seeing that because the approach is not to simply try to decentralize everything. It's taking a thoughtful look at the procedures involved in the study. All of our study protocols have a schedule of events, a table that delineates over time what procedures need to be performed. And by taking a thoughtful review of that schedule of events, identifying those opportunities to introduce different decentralized approaches and methods. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to join with the FDA in the US at a panel at the Association for Cancer Research, AACR meeting with some 25,000 cancer researchers. And our topic for this conversation was decentralizing research. And it really helps to demystify that we can use these methods to improve access and equity in oncology trials. Really, the criteria we need to look at is the safety profile of the molecule, the route of administration and the considerations for drug handling and drug prep, our endpoints and other assessments in the study, and to identify based on those if we're able to decentralize some or all of those procedures and visits, or if there's really constraints based on the molecule that prevent us from doing so.
So basically, it's not really a matter of the kind of assessments that involve primarily, for instance, questionnaires being better suited than those that would go beyond, the questionnaires, the visual assessment to look at, what kind of biomarkers are changing during the trial. You can use them pretty much for vaccine research, for instance.
You can use these approaches for studies that are using self-reported measurements like PROs and diaries, but we can use these approaches when we have endpoints that are based on wet biomarkers that are based on specimens like blood, urine, or otherwise, simply by collecting those specimens closer to the patient's home, whether it's in their home or in a clinic nearby, or even studies that are using imaging endpoints, not by proposing we're going to drive an MRI to a patient's home, but simply by letting them use imaging centers that are closer to their home. But then we also see these opportunities today to modernize and digitize the endpoints that we use in our trials. You know, a very common measurement, a very common endpoint for studies in movement disorders and heart failure is the 6-minute walk test, which is simply having a patient come to the clinic to observe them walking on a 10 or 20 meter distance in the hallway and monitoring for different physiologic factors, which we know we can do with a patient from home. We know we can monitor them on video or use different types of digital measurements, whether on their phone or on their wrist. And so as we modernize and digitize our endpoints, we're going to have far more ability to have flexibility in where people can be in order to collect that data, no longer requiring them to come to the clinic just for that measurement to take place, but having more confidence that we can collect data with the same integrity from most anywhere.
You mentioned data integrity. That was going to be my next question. Obviously, it's clear they are expanding the scope of what can be done during clinical investigations, but do they allow investigators to maintain the same level of scope on patient safety, on how they provide oversight and protecting the integrity of data compared to the traditional approach?
It's a fabulous question because our guardrails for clinical research remain the same: patient safety and data integrity. And everything that we do that may be innovative or traditional always needs to conform within those guardrails. Now, decentralizing research doesn't have to mean that we're leaving patients on their own and in the wild and creating distance in terms of oversight for the investigator over the patient. Decentralizing done right should mean people have more connectivity, more access to one another, just like the way we're able to access and connect with one another right now, no longer having to wait for the opportunity for me to travel to Johannesburg or for you to travel to New York City. And so the requirements and expectations of oversight are still there. And fortunately, there are robust tools that can help investigators to have the oversight that they need, whether a data point is being collected through a sensor or a device or by a visiting nurse in the home. We still have to have in our plans the evidence to show that investigators have full oversight and control. You know, there was a guidance, a recommendation paper from the regulators in Europe that came out last December on this topic, and it emphasizes exactly the point you're raising here, that sponsors and study teams need to be able to demonstrate that investigators have full oversight and control over the data. You know, as we're introducing more of these digital measures and we develop, qualify, validate them with different testing, we'll have even more confidence and ability that we can measure consistently regardless of where an individual may be.
Let's talk about whether you think decentralized trials are likely to open new opportunities in the African context and how they're likely to do that.
It's a great question. I think that certainly those that are planning studies that are global in scope will be concerned about global regulation, privacy, and other rules with which they need to conform, and how those might vary from country to country and from culture to culture in terms of expectations. There are technology constraints that need to be navigated, both in terms of ensuring access to the right types of bandwidth and connectivity for individuals, as well as access to the technologies themselves. We need to make sure that investigators and patients are able to use these tools, that we're giving them the proper level of support, and that we're making it easy for these tools to be used. Sometimes in our early instances with these trials, we might send a site a lot of different technology without the right level of support attached. It creates burden, it overwhelms, it creates reluctance and resistance resistance to use these different approaches. And so making sure that our technology and our support are working together to help people in terms of using these tools in their research studies. Importantly, so much of this comes back to making sure that we're using these approaches to create stronger connections between people and not leave either site staff or patients in research feeling disconnected and isolated. So much of this, though, comes down to change management for all of us. These are new approaches, and they require us to rethink certain processes or rethink certain ways that we've done work for a very long time. And for some of us, that's really hard. And so helping our colleagues along that change curve to help make these approaches easier and more accessible by making sure the technology is right, the support is right, the training is right to support adoption.
Now, let's talk about diversity in clinical trials. Diversity has to be one of the key defining issues of our time when we are talking about research and development of medical products. Are you seeing clinical trials actually doing more to increase diversity in the context of the decentralized approach, but also the traditional? And I mean here, not just talking about the importance of diversity, which everybody does, but the real challenge is actually putting that into practice and expanding the scope of participants in clinical trials.
It's such an important question to ask. You know, in the last 2 or 3 years, the conversations have certainly gotten louder about the importance of representation, equity, diversity in clinical research. But have we been able to truly move the needle? We certainly see a lot more investments that organizations are making. We see large and mid-sized pharma companies that have put in place leadership positions solely focused on ensuring and focusing on the tools and strategies to improve diversity and equity and inclusion in our research. We see strategies that are being deployed from improving investigator training for representative investigators, improving diversity of staff at sites to help make sure that patients feel like the investigators are like them and not some distant, unfamiliar group of people. We see a lot of different strategies that are being deployed right now, but I think it's still, in many ways, the jury is still out if we're seeing these bearing fruit. Now, in the United States, the FDA has introduced guidance setting an expectation for diversity action plans that study teams have to come forward and show that they have a plan for diversity. But what we don't have is an expectation of accountability. It's one thing to show that we have a plan, but lots of people may have a plan. The question is, do we follow that plan, and are we able to demonstrate that that plan produced a desired outcome? And I think we don't yet have incentives and penalties linked to those plans. So we'll see if the plans alone are enough to drive change. It certainly is helping in terms of commitments that people are laying out with the right staff in place and putting plans in place. Those are certainly key steps in the process. But I think it's too early to claim victory here, and we really need to see if these plans are put into action and if they make a difference in earning trust and improving access for research for everybody.
People have good intentions and they make plans, but following them through seems to be a problem oftentimes. What about the methods that are used in decentralized clinical trials? What are the expectations of regulators in terms of the validation that they expect, and what many people who are considering using this method, I guess this approach in African countries will want to know is whether the available methods of using this approach of decentralization are validated well enough in Black populations that, the larger populations you might find in the African context.
It's a great point, especially as it relates to the digital measures that we're increasingly relying on as endpoints for our studies. Some tools we may use in a decentralized trial, like the use of video, the way we're connecting right now, or even an electronic informed consent, we have good and clear processes for how to qualify and validate that they're secure or appropriate for that setting. But in other cases, we're modernizing our measurements and modernizing our endpoints. I'm wearing a watch right now that has the right types of sensors on the back of it to be able to monitor my heart rate or even perform an ECG. But is it only validated, or was it developed for people with my color skin and not the full representation of diverse skin tones that we would want it to work on in order to support my research study? And so it's a really important question that you're raising. There are some interesting databases that are developing that can help us to track the qualification of different connected devices, of different sensors, that can help us to understand and track what was the body of evidence that was used to qualify or validate that measurement. Because it's one thing for a regulator to approve or clear this device as a medical device and allow it to be on the market, but it is very different to have equivalent confidence that it's measuring consistently for everybody. And it's hard, I think, for study teams to be expected to be technology experts to be able to tease that apart. Fortunately, with some of these data resources, these types of public or subscription databases that are emerging, hopefully it will help us to have better access and visibility to understand how are these qualified and validated and in what populations. Using a digital measure as a new endpoint, in many cases we have clear pathways with regulators on how to test and qualify that, how to run the types of studies that would be needed to generate evidence. But you're raising such an important point, not just whether the device can be shown in some select population of patients that it works, but can it be shown that it's capable and qualified across all the range of patients that we're looking to enroll in our studies.
Now, what about the business case for decentralized clinical trials? What is the business case? And is it supported by real-world data on the value that it delivers for patients and for businesses as well?
That's a great point. I'd say that for most pharma and biotech organizations, many research organizations today, there are really three elements to their business case. The first are the patient factors themselves, key performance indicators around recruitment and retention that we can measure in our portfolio, as well as other patient factors such as diversity and representation and measures we're deploying around access and experience. Yes. Whether those are individual key performance indicators or whether we're looking in aggregate to show that by improving the speed of recruitment and supporting retention, we can reduce the cycle time for this molecule and improve its commercial viability. I think the second body is a little less straightforward to quantify, but it's the business case around business continuity and risk mitigation. The investments that we make around anticipating challenges to the continuity of our business, including our research enterprise, and the disruption that we know can be created in a heartbeat, and making sure that we have resilience and the ability to make quick changes if patients can't reach sites. I think the third aspect of the business case we're seeing right now is largely coming out of Europe, and that's around sustainability and the environmental impact of clinical research. And as more and more pharmaceutical and biotech companies are holding themselves accountable to ESG and corporate social responsibility and reporting, it'll be interesting to see what role decentralized research can play in helping to show a quantifiable impact on reducing their carbon footprint, on reducing their environmental impact of their research process. There are groups in Europe right now that are doing a great job starting to quantify the carbon offset associated with study procedures, which can help in the business case for decentralizing research by showing supporting additional evidence that these investments in decentralizing not only reduce burden for patients, but can reduce burden for the planet.
Can decentralized clinical trials be used in all phases of drug development, or are they more suited for some than others?
It's a great question. Most of these applications we see do lean in more towards later phases of research where we have increased confidence in the safety of a molecule. Also, our very early phase research can often be our most complex in terms of burdens of procedures. That being said, even phase 1 clinical trials are finding that some of the long-term safety follow-up can be done decentralized. And so we might need that patient to be in the clinic for the earliest dosing with that molecule, but for some of the follow-up visits, can we support those with less burden for those individuals? Certainly in phase 2, we see a good amount of adoption of these approaches, and as we move into larger populations with more confidence in the safety of the molecule, we certainly see even more adoption with these approaches.
So they are certainly very well suited for expanding the size of the trial population. But in the African context, we always have so many things to worry about. And one question that comes to mind is whether decentralized trials need specialized equipment to conduct them, or whether the requirements in terms of the equipment that you'd require can be made available in any geography that you may want to look at.
So we see this. There's this risk today of a new digital divide. And we've talked in the past about the digital divide among patients and people, that perhaps some with underserved populations or underserved individuals might not have access to the same technology that others have. And I think we risk this among researchers today about a digital divide, that the approaches of decentralizing research are for the elite and the privileged, the large pharmaceutical and big global funded studies, whereas for academic researchers and for others more local, these approaches can seem expensive and hard to access. Now, fortunately, some of the approaches that are key for decentralizing are very scalable. Using video, using electronic informed consent can be very accessible, as compared with some decentralized methods like qualifying and validating a digital measurement that requires a special connected device on an individual's wrist. Those can bring more cost and more logistics. Certainly for global pharmaceutical and biotech companies that are working with CROs as partners, they're getting more and more confident supporting those approaches at global scale. But for researchers, either in the US, Europe, Africa, or anywhere, individual researchers, I think, still find many of these tools hard to access. Fortunately, electronic consent and video as cornerstones are much easier. But some of the more sophisticated digital measures right now are really much less democratized.
So great potential there for widening the gap. Again, the inequality in terms of access. What are the current regulations governing decentralized clinical trial data in African countries? For instance, the current regulations allow the transfer of data for analysis elsewhere. I mean, how does it work at the moment?
Fortunately, most of our decentralized methods themselves aren't necessarily new. We've used things like electronic diaries and even electronic consent in most regions of the world for a number of years. For decentralized trials, we're simply using many of these tools in a much more deliberate way to create more location flexibility for individuals. In most countries, the guardrails, the requirements are really unchanged. We hold ourselves accountable to the same rules that have always existed regarding electronically sourced data in our studies, or regarding electronic signatures, regarding electronic diaries, and so many other areas that regulators have already addressed and already spoken to.
Right.
Now, we did have guidance that was produced from most global regulators during the pandemic, with recommendations on how to continue their research during that frenetic period. But even in those cases, the regulators didn't change the rules. They simply encouraged the adoption of smart and thoughtful approaches. Now, as I mentioned, in Europe, we have seen decentralized trial recommendations. In the US, guidance document on decentralized trials is imminent and may even be out by the time this podcast is posted. We also see in other countries following suit as well. In most cases, these guidance and recommendations are simply clarifying and filling gaps. They're not creating barriers or constraints on the ability to use these. They're simply laying out key considerations, like we've talked about, ensuring investigators have proper oversight, as an example.
Yes, well, we are expecting our African Medicines Agency to start operating anytime now. And we hope that this is one issue they'll be looking at in terms of how you have alignment in terms of guidelines, in the same way that they are having in Europe. And of course, in the US, you have the US FDA, and that simplifies things considerably. Now, one of the challenges, Craig, that faces African research is this idea of helicopter research. How do you see decentralization impacting this problem, where you have studies being run from overseas? What do you see as the way of overcoming some of those challenges that already exists in terms of the division of labor between local researchers and their colleagues overseas?
Oh, that's a great question. One thing I do want to make sure I'm referencing regarding the prior question on global regulation, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, DTRA.org, has resources that they're increasingly posting and making available on the new release of their website with a global regulatory insights map to help track different regulatory and policy expectations in different regions. And of course, that's very dynamic and hopefully will be an accessible resource for any interested researchers. Now, the question you raise about helicopter is a really interesting one. And I don't know that decentralized alone necessarily is going to help or hurt in that regard. I think, like so many things, it really is about the implementation, because one could use decentralized research approaches in a way that only exacerbate the problem that you described around helicopter research and disconnecting, the ability to grow and enrich the local research community. It's so many of these methods are really just that. They're methods and tools. And whether they're used to improve equity, whether they're used to improve connectivity for people, whether they're used to improve local infrastructure, really depends on the users, right? And how they're being designed and deployed. If they're done in a deliberate way that can help improve local infrastructure and leave behind sustaining capability, or if they were just designed in a transactional way, meant to service the needs of one study and one protocol, and then break down and leave very little support behind. I'm sorry to say that it's so much of it really will come down back to the people, and hopefully that are doing things in a way that is designed to leave behind good.
Yes, down to the people and possibly regulators also, in terms of the accountability that they can expect. Now, Craig, do you see the decentralized approach being the future of clinical trials? What sort of models do you see being required as we go forward into the next decade, which is projected to have more outbreaks and all kinds of challenges that we can expect on the global level in terms of disease outbreaks and so forth?
I think these decentralized methods that we're talking about today will just become normalized in parts of our accessible and expected research toolkit, both because we'll have more operating confidence. As our regulators will provide increasing clarity, but this will become increasingly the expectation among patients and research participants. If they can connect with their doctor for other types of encounters online, why would this cutting edge technology enabled new medicine still rely on legacy approaches and not be keeping similar pace? And so I think there'll be increasing expectation among patients. Ultimately, I think even IRBs and ethics committees will start to look at these approaches and challenge study teams on why you are not using approaches that can improve access and accessibility for patients. I don't think ethics committees would challenge in that way today because we don't have operating confidence and regulatory confidence across the board. But over the coming 5 years, we absolutely will. And I think it will become natural for ethics committees to expect that study teams are using the tools available to improve access and equity in their research. I think also, as you're describing over the coming decade, we'll start to see increased appreciation of master protocols and platform trials, studies that are not built just to test one drug for one indication and build up all of that infrastructure simply to break it all down at the end, but find more opportunities for platform trials and master protocols that can be up and running and test multiple molecules or multiple indications over time. Decentralized research methods will pair very nicely with those strategies as they develop and mature. Regulators have been very favorable about platform trials and master protocols in the US and abroad, and certainly during the pandemic with studies from Solidarity, Recovery, and others. So many of our key questions about what worked and what didn't for COVID-19 were answered not from individual trials, but from these types of master protocols. And so I look forward to seeing those not only in infectious diseases, but across other disease areas over the coming decade, creating improved infrastructure for research by letting us share more approaches, and hopefully doing more to improve access for people, not just into the one study they happen to hear about from a doctor, but for the right studies that are right for them.
Certainly on the African continent, we are always open to approaches that increases access and participation. It's clear that the decentralized approach is obviously being widely used in Europe, in the US, perhaps elsewhere as well. Are you aware to what extent it's already being used in Africa, or if it's being used at all?
I think that there are some sponsored research studies that are using certain decentralized methods at global scale, whether in the US and Europe, whether China or Japan, whether Africa or Latin and South America. Some of those approaches, like electronic consent and use of video, tend to be most accessible. I think some of the other approaches do get trickier and trickier along the kind of continuum of operational feasibility, right? Those that require significant bandwidth, those that require local infrastructure, just get, a little more difficult to bring out at enterprise scale. So, for example, I think that research sponsors have gotten more confident with using visiting nurses and home health services in research studies in some countries, but it really comes down to being a local challenge, right? Yes. Are there locally staffed visiting nurse services that are trained in research processes that I could deploy for my studies, or is it going to require a significant amount of retraining of staff to be familiar and comfortable with not just providing healthcare in the home, but supporting a clinical research protocol in the home?
So to finish up, Craig, what would you say to a clinical investigator who's thinking of using this approach in an African country, what should they be considering? What should they be thinking about in planning for such a trial approach in an African context?
A decentralized clinical trial is not one archetype. It is not one thing. It is not all or nothing. You can look at your study that you're designing and look at your schedule of events and start to identify opportunities that can create more location flexibility for the patients in your trial, even if those approaches can spare 1 or 2 visits by using accessible technologies like video or electronic informed consent. Those can be wins. Sometimes I think we can get overwhelmed by all of the different world of the possible, and it can feel like we can't do anything that could make a meaningful difference in this space. But in fact, every study that takes one step forward in the right direction creates aggregate momentum and learning for all of us. And so if every researcher on the continent is looking at these opportunities and can introduce 1 or 2 new strategies that can help improve access and reduce burden in aggregate, that can be a tremendous signal of momentum.
Craig, thank you so much for coming on today and for sharing your insights with us. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for this opportunity.